Welcome to Real World Perspectives on Poverty Solutions. I'm Trevor Bechtel, facilitator of this series with Poverty Solutions at the University of Michigan and instructor of the course that accompanies this lecture series. Over these next 7 weeks, we will introduce key issues regarding the causes and consequences of poverty in this virtual space, featuring experts in policy and practice from across the nation. We are an audience of students enrolled in our course, community members, academics, policymakers, and interested people from Southeast Michigan and beyond. And we are really excited about today's session that puts Indivar Dutta-Gupta in conversation with the Faculty Director of Poverty Solutions, Luke Schaefer, focused on an exciting day of testimony at the Select Subcommittee on the Coronavirus Crisis. But before we dig into this conversation, I want to remind our viewers that we want to hear from you. You can submit questions and comments in the comment box to the right on YouTube or on Twitter using the hashtag #PovertySolutions. We look forward to a meaningful conversation and we'll try to get to as many of your questions as possible. We welcome an open and respectful dialogue and want to let folks know that we will be responsive to any inappropriate content. I invite you to check out our resources, tune in for additional events, and find other ways to connect with other poverty research at our website, poverty.umich.edu. So with that, I'll introduce my colleague, Luke Schaefer, who will introduce our speaker.
Thank you, Trevor, and thanks for all you do to make this great series happen. It's exciting to be back again this fall. I really look forward to this series and appreciate everyone who does so much to make it happen. And it's great to be here on my first time with my old friend now and valued colleague, Indivar Dutta-Gupta. He serves as the co-executive director of the Georgetown Center on Poverty and Inequality, where he leads work to develop and advance policy recommendations that alleviate poverty and inequality, advance racial and gender equity, and expand economic inclusion. So right in line with all the things that we talk about at Poverty Solutions. He serves as a board member of the National Academy of Social Insurance and is an advisor to the Aspen Institute's Benefits 21 Initiative, Liberation in a Generation, and the Policy Academies. Early in his career, Indy served as Ways and Means Committee professional staff in the U.S. House of Representatives for the Subcommittee on Income Security and Family Support. He is also a Harry S. Truman Scholar, and Truman Scholars, I think, are a special group, and I didn't know that about you, so that's cool, good to know. He was named Washington Life magazine influential 40 and under leaders in 2013, and a rising star 40 and under in the same magazine, I think. So, Indy, it's really great to have you with us.
It's terrific to be here with you, Luke. This whole series is a fantastic idea, and I'm honored to be a part of it.
So, Indy, we have students from all across the university and community members, but one thing, especially for our students, is they often enjoy just hearing about career paths and trajectory. So I wonder if you could just spend a couple minutes telling us your story and what it was like working on the Hill and what you've been doing ever since.
Yeah, so let's see, I'll go sort of in reverse chronological order. I have been helping lead our Economic Security and Opportunity Initiative in some form or another here at the Georgetown Center on Poverty and Inequality for a little over 7 years. When I started, it was just me, and then I was able to bring on another colleague soon after, but we stayed small initially, and now we're 16 growing to 18 and maybe more folks. And as you noted, trying to develop ideas really at the policy, programmatic, and even practice and systems change levels to really move the needle on poverty and extreme economic inequality in the US with a focus on racial and gender equity. But before that, I actually worked at a consulting firm, a smallish consulting firm that consulted for nonprofits, foundations, workers groups, children's groups called Friedman Consulting. And before that, I was at the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities as a policy advisor and senior policy advisor, mostly on the federal budget and tax team, but working across teams, especially with the teams that focus on programs other programs directly supporting people with low incomes. And just before that, I was at the Committee on Ways and Means, as you mentioned, from about 2007 through 2010. And over those nearly 4 years, we, among other things, got hit with a recession. So I worked extensively on unemployment benefits, but I also worked on trade adjustment assistance, climate change, the Waxman-Markey bill, the American Clean Energy and Security Act from 2007, general issues, economic issues, long-term employment, and our subcommittee has jurisdiction over the Temporary Assistance for Needy Families Program, child welfare programs, and we also were quite engaged in a farm bill reauthorization, since the Ways and Means Committee has so many of the levers of raising revenues.
SNAP in it, which would have food assistance, right?
Well, so the Ways and Means Committee was helping pay for the SNAP increases that the Agriculture Committee was moving. So as a result of that, we got involved in the policies as well. And we worked a lot on poverty measurement, which is an area I know, Luke, you've also done a lot of really important work. And the committee also did some timely work on subsidized jobs, which Luke both worked a lot on. Yeah. And before that, I worked at the Center for American Progress, supporting a poverty task force, which was formed in response to Hurricane Katrina in 2005. And I did some of that work as a Bill Emerson National Hunger Fellow through the Congressional Hunger Center, which I'd recommend for folks who are looking, especially for early career opportunities and ways to break into this space. And that fellowship first placed me actually in a local site doing local anti-hunger work, food stamps, it was called then, but SNAP outreach. Yeah. I'm not sure if it's called SNAP in Michigan. But
Family Assistance Program in Michigan.
Okay. And then we
not confusing it all to have multiple names for the same program. No. Government. Yeah.
Right. No, very true. And I was working even with food banks here, with direct service providers, trying to help people sign up for SNAP, but even worked on things like online websites and online tools to encourage people to do that. So my career, like a lot, I think, was far from planned, quite windy, but I have tried to focus a lot on ensuring that people have a basic foundation for support to succeed in this country.
And where does that come from? Why, this is clearly, you might say that you've done it all at this point, and especially focused just on that, sort of making sure everyone has a baseline. So what brought you into that work? Where does the sort of drive to keep on working on these issues come from?
I mean, that's a great question. I mean, I think for me, there's multiple motivations. Sometimes you realize it after the fact. I think my family came here with not a lot of money, but we did have relatives and a place to stay initially. I was 3.5 when we came from India. My parents were certainly highly educated and worked very hard, but there were a lot of challenges. My father worked night shifts sometimes, and I have vivid memories of him being the only person there to kind of take care of me, but he needed to sleep while I was up trying to play, and just the challenges with childcare and caregiving, I think, set back my mother's career many years, as it took her maybe a decade to pursue a PhD that she was pursuing. So I have a lot of sort of personal recollections, including of my father essentially begging a local preschool just to give me a spot. This is a challenge people face to this day. And it made a huge difference that I was able to get that spot, and support from school meal programs and the like. Absolutely, I could see it not only made a difference for me, but for others. But I think in addition to that, I think it became quite clear to me how much untapped potential there is in this country. You know, Luke, you've done a lot of thinking about it, but just how many children, for sure, but you know, frankly, even adults don't really get to develop to their fullest potential, and that requires a lot of course, a nurturing environment in many ways. But one thing government can do and can do well is ensure that sort of basic living standard. You know, there's obviously more to ensure loving relationships and family environments, but it's always seemed to me that this is something that can be done and done quite well.
Yeah, thank you for that. One more sort of personal context. I'm just curious. I think sometimes students think about maybe working in government, maybe as a staffer on Ways and Means, or maybe in state government, and some might want to work outside of government, but sort of focused on what government should do. And you've sort of been on both sides. And I just wonder if you might have any advice for students, or think about the pros and cons of inside or outside.
Yeah, first, I think that it's worthwhile to have a variety of experiences. I think everyone plays a role in at least my theory of change and how we get to a more equitable society with a reasonable floor for everyone. And I would try to explore through maybe internships or even short-term job opportunities, explore these different possibilities. And you might find that some of them are better suited for your personality, better suited for your skills. I mean, say you want to spend all day in front of spreadsheets, right? That there may be limited opportunities to do that in some organizations or in congressional offices. But then again, there's the Joint Economic Committee, and there's maybe lots of opportunities in agencies to do that at all levels of government. And I think that people shouldn't try to necessarily just come to an answer once and for all. People move around all the time. The pace can be different. There's a lot of factors that it will be hard to really decide where you can make the biggest impact and live the life that you want to lead. So hopefully the variety of experiences will help you figure that out. The one other thing I was going to say, Luke, is there are smart people everywhere. There are good people working everywhere. I mean, I think there's a sense that, or maybe an underappreciation for how deeply knowledgeable and committed people are in different roles in our society. But I mean, Luke, you've worked closely with policymakers at all levels, from the White House to Congress to the state agencies, and I'm sure you can attest to that. So you can work with good people anywhere. So find out what really works for you and your personality and skill set.
Good. Yeah. So matching the opportunity with what keeps you, it's a good match for your skills, for what makes you just feel good, at the end of the day of what you've done. Yeah.
And maybe for that period in your life, it could change over time.
So in happenstance, it turned out you and I were testifying together this week in front of a hearing. Now it was an interesting experience because we were both in person. And Indy, I think you testify once a month or so, as far as I can tell. It's a little more rare for me, but we went and were in person, but then it turned out most of the congressional representatives joined virtually. So we testified to a room with just a handful of people in it. But on a very important topic of trying to make sense of all of the things that we did to support families and, keep that stable safety net that you spoke of during the coronavirus pandemic and the economic crisis. And I wanted to give you a minute to walk through and tell us what you were looking forward to saying, and what some of the points that you were hoping to convey to policymakers.
Yeah, it was quite an experience. It always is, and I was glad to sit at the same table with you, which was truly a total coincidence since we've planned this session for quite some time now. I I was really looking forward to telling a story that would help us shape our understanding of what we've done and what we should do going forward. And I think broadly and quite similarly to your testimony and that of some of the other witnesses, I think that despite key shortcomings, the response with essentially four major pieces of legislation since mid-March of last year has been absolutely extraordinary. I think unmatched by any other country in the world on the fiscal side, and possibly unmatched by any country, including our own in history. And it did a lot of good. Some people still suffered, and nothing will take away from the now nearly 700,000 lives lost and the devastation surrounding the pandemic in the context of health in that sense. But again, one thing we did know how to do is get resources to people. We have the wherewithal, especially at the federal government level, to do that. So I wanted to make sure that we appreciated what we had done, and then indicate that there were two, beyond the actual pandemic itself, there were two reasons why we always have to act, and in this case, why we have to act in such a big way that I think people underappreciate. One is we have such extreme inequities in this country, economically, by race, by gender, that even after the longest economic expansion in US history, arguably, a lot of families were still living quite precariously. And two, that we have a relatively weak social protection system. And what I mean by that is, again, compared to other wealthy countries, when people are struggling, temporary or partial disability, unemployment, and in this country, we offer quite limited help in many cases. There's a lot of variability across states because we have a federal system where states have enormous control, especially when it comes to our unemployment assistance system.
Right.
And so we had to compensate for that. I mean, we have gaping holes, no paid leave program, which is so unusual, no sick leave guarantee, right? We didn't already have a meaningful cash assistance, a robust cash assistance program or child allowance. We don't give unemployment assistance to new job seekers or returning workers. And despite all the progress the Affordable Care Act made, and even some of the provisions in law that were enacted on a temporary basis, we don't have a health coverage guarantee in this country.
Yeah. So we needed to sort of make up for a lot at the start. And, I was quite, I had no confidence at all that our unemployment insurance program could really be changed in ways that could meaningfully catch most workers, given the rise of gig workers and non-standard work arrangements, all of the various ways, as you mentioned, that people were left out of that system. And so that's one sort of the examples of things that we did was so different from anything we'd done before.
Right. We took a blueprint of disaster unemployment assistance, which has some serious shortcomings, and quickly put together the pandemic unemployment assistance program, which at times was supporting more workers than the main sort of permanent unemployment assistance program, which tells you a lot about the shortcomings of that system.
Where people are.
Yeah.
Indy, we've got a video question from Kayla Glory. And while Trevor cues that up, I just want to say all the students in the class, take a look at how great this video is. And next time, we want you to do one too. Make sure you send one to Trevor. So Trevor, will you roll Kayla's question?
Hi, my name is Kayla Guillory. During the congressional hearings on Wednesday, there was a lot of conversation about the COVID relief packages and encouragement for many of those efforts, like the child tax credit, for example, to be made permanent. So my question is, how can some of the data and information that we gained during the pandemic inform our understanding of universal basic income and whether or not it would provide relief for Americans in a sustainable way? In addition, if some of these programs like the child tax credit were to be made permanent, what should policymakers consider in order to ensure that they're effective years or even decades into the future? Thank you.
Great questions. So let's start with how I think the data and research from the current experience can help us as we think about a UBI or other approaches to maybe guaranteeing people income. I think we can learn quite a bit. Professor Schaefer has looked at Census Household Pulse Survey data to look at what certain recovery rebate and economic impact payments have had on families when they receive it. We can see what families do with the child tax credit that's being paid monthly now as they receive it. We can see in other high frequency and real-time data from JP Morgan Chase Institute and others, what happens with to families and their earnings and finances when unemployment assistance benefits are cut or reinstated or increased or shrunk. And I think one of the things that we'll have to do is also sort of, step back. I'm not sure when the pandemic will be over, of course, but step back and look holistically. But I think that we can use the data and research to both understand impacts and understand what we could do differently and better. I think it will also underscore the challenges that families face. I mean, we're talking a lot more in this pandemic about things like buying school supplies than we usually do, but that's a challenge families face all the time, and maybe a smaller share of families, but some families will struggle with that at any given time. We're drawing more attention in some ways to even the debt that people had to pay off and pay down, right? With modest wage growth in recent decades and earnings growth, a lot of families have undertaken significant debt, including to finance higher education. And I think we can learn a lot about what happens when you relieve people of some of those pressures. Not just what happens financially, not just how do they spend the money, but what happens even with their mental health. What happens even with decisions they might make about starting a new household or other quite consequential economic decisions. So I think there's a lot to learn because we did some very large things and we did it in ways that we can measure and document. The truth is you can't learn everything from experiments or pure experiments, from randomized controlled trials.
Right.
You got to learn from real life sometimes too. And we'll do our best, and I think learn something there. I would say on how can we ensure these permanent programs are more effective? I mean, my biggest hope there is that we invest in the right infrastructure. So what I mean by that is, let's take the child tax credit expansion. The IRS doesn't have an office that sort of is there ready to deal with questions from households or families. The culture may not be there. It may be more of an investigative or enforcement culture. So might we think differently over the long term if we are going to deliver this benefit through the Internal Revenue Service as a tax credit about that infrastructure? And also, it's very difficult to go from 0 to 60. It's easier to go from 30 to 60. So can we maintain some administrative infrastructure, technological infrastructure, human infrastructure throughout the business cycle? I think would help a lot in ensuring that over the long run, these policies and programs are well administered.
So Michelle Marin has a question asking, how do you respond to those who acknowledge the effectiveness of this package of stuff that we've done, but worries that the cost of these relief package programs, particularly the permanent child tax credit, isn't sustainable. How do we pay for it, and how much do we worry about it? And that's a really interesting question. I think it came up in the testimony where across, we had different witnesses, and I would say one of the witnesses really took this position that what we did at the start of the pandemic was the best thing we'd ever done. It was well-timed. But maybe we shouldn't be spending so much going forward. Maybe we shouldn't be thinking about permanent changes because of the cost.
I mean, I think we tend to have a sort of, I don't know the technical term, but an accounting bias of, what shows up on a balance sheet we count when we often don't count things that don't, even though they could be quite costly. We know that we're losing 4 or 5% of GDP, if that's all you cared about, economic activity, to persistent childhood poverty in this country every year. We know that these programs actually, over the long run, if you look at the sort of net present value of the benefits over time to some of these investments, like the child tax credit, the programs cost a fraction of their immediate budgetary cost. And I would also sort of argue to folks that, in the long run, we have enormous economic potential in general. I mean, we should compare some of these investments to the fact that we're talking about a $20 trillion a year economy that will grow with some of these productive investments, in my judgment. But no, you're not going to convince everyone, and ultimately even supporters will argue about where to draw the line. How far should the benefits go up the income spectrum? Mm-hmm. And I will say that there are some benefits to some programs being widely accessible and widely reached. Some political benefits, maybe even some administrative and other benefits as well. And it can also be the case that these programs will give you the biggest bang for your buck for when they reach the most marginalized and disadvantaged children and families. So both things can be true, and that's obviously a conversation that was had in the child tax credit expansion, for example, does phase out at some point, but it ends up reaching like 95+% of households, at least they're eligible.
Right. And what's the benefit? I mean, that's true both of the child tax credit and the stimulus payments, where they went quite high up the economic ladder, and some folks might sort of say, why are we spending so much money up there, higher up the ladder? What view do you take on that?
Well, yeah, I think that's a complicated question. I mean, there's certainly a purist view of more universal programs are invariably better. I think unemployment insurance probably provides a counterpoint to that to some extent. But then there's a view of essentially programs that serve people who have lower incomes are, as they say, programs for the poor are poor programs. And so I think that that said, we've seen large expansions in some of those in recent decades, SNAP in particular, but also Medicaid. And we have even seen expansions of programs that target more low and moderate income households. So earned income tax credit in particular. But I think that there's a political case that the programs will have broader support. We do live in theory, a representative democracy, and you can imagine that some people will be more likely to support a program that reaches them. Social Security being a case in point, I think, of a program that has very widespread support throughout the income spectrum. Of course, it's a contributory insurance program, so that could be part of it too. There's a view that, and these are related, that it'll just be administered better if people are worried about people with more power. In this country, often people with more limited incomes have the least power, the least influence. They're not going to fundraisers or even have time or bandwidth to work on campaigns at the same rate, or volunteer for campaigns at the same rate as people with higher incomes. And so you could think about it that way. I tend to take a somewhat nuanced view and ask, is it worth the effort in screening? And sometimes it could be, and sometimes it really isn't. Like asset limits.
Money on screening, yeah.
Asset limits are a great example in SNAP, right? And I actually think it might be counterproductive for the Medicare long-term care supports as well. But so I think that's an important question. And one other thing, we don't often think about it this way, but it does matter, in my judgment, what the effective tax rates are for high income households. If we had the sort of effective tax rates we had maybe 70 years ago or so in this country, you'd be taxing back a lot of the benefits effectively. And so the fiscal cost shrinks. But in the US right now, we don't have especially high, in my judgment, effective tax rates on some of the highest income households. So you get back some of the money, but not all. And some things like refundable tax credit aren't taxable. So that's something to keep in mind too.
Right.
Yeah.
So we're going to put up Alexis Badarat's question, and I'm sort of going to combine it too with this question. So she asked, do you think that there are ways to design interventions that avoid the roller coaster of rising and falling financial security we saw during the pandemic when things ran out? So we think about these one-time measures versus, something more stable. And I am, at a moment where I sort of worry about, I when I think about a UBI, it's true for me that it's hard for me to think like how we pay for something like that if we were going to have it be stabilized, you'd be talking about a really major restructuring of society. And I'm not ready to go there. So what about this question of sort of trying to stabilize and maybe we'll talk about the child tax credit, but also, tell us about sort of these other components too, and how we should be thinking about this.
Yeah, Luca, yeah, sure. Those sentiments, I would say first that we can have automatic stabilization built in to our programs. There is some of that in the unemployment insurance system. It's grossly inadequate. There's some of that implicitly in other open-ended mandatory spending programs, meaning the Treasury Department, has to pay whatever the formulas say they have to pay for state Medicaid programs. When the state spends money, the federal government has to provide the match. But it's, again, quite clearly inadequate. And I do want to point out that a good chunk of what the federal government does, and certainly did during the last recession, is just push back on state and local government cuts that can actually drag down the economy considerably. So the whole idea of the government providing stimulus should consider the fact that the federal government, which can typically borrow and at extraordinarily low rates in recessions in recent history, is offsetting the fact that state and local governments often are not in that situation. Right, they're trying to balance their budgets, which is one of the worst things you can do in a situation like a recession. You have the sort of paradox of thrift, and if one person pulls back, then all economic activity can sort of start pulling back, or one actor or set of actors. So I think that we should think about the automatic stabilizers for sure. We should, a progressive tax code, I think, is underappreciated, but it does help a bit with income volatility in stabilizing. So if your income falls, your tax bill falls, disproportionately relative to your income. But it's mostly the federal income taxes that add progressivity to on balance to our tax code. A lot of state and local tax systems are not so progressive, so we should think about more progressive tax systems. We could think about averaging or allowing people to use either of multiple recent years of income. We did that in this case for some of the economic impact payments. There's sort of a choice where the Treasury would, by default, use 1 year of income, but if you want it to be strategic, you could choose another year of income. That helps, again, with volatile incomes. And I think, again, we can think about just automatic, not just with existing programs, but even automatic cash payments, which we've done actually recession after recession. In fact, typically all we do is sort of an automatic cash payment to some group of people. But we started with the Recovery Act, I think, doing something far broader as an immediate response. Yeah.
We included the very lowest income in those payments for the first time, and they were bigger than they've ever been before. So it was a difference in scale of an idea that we had before. Indy Simone Allegri asks mentions you have many ambitious ideas in your testimony, and as you're looking to the forward, what would you prioritize above all else?
That's a great question. Well, there's some urgency right now. I'm sure folks are following in something that Luke, you and Diane, and I think Dr. Wilson also prioritized, which is the child tax credit expansion. It could be that families who are in many cases, quite clearly still struggling, will experience a huge loss then in income next year if we don't extend the child tax credit payment. And not just that, but right now it's not scheduled to be monthly, starting January 1. We did it for half of this year. Right now, the rest of the credit will be paid out with tax filing next year. So that's urgent. I do think that a major source of our overall macroeconomic stabilization success was unemployment assistance. Mm-hmm. And yet we appear to be heading not just back to where we were before, but probably to states again cutting their programs. So folks,
why states cut that program? Why is it so popular to?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's not a program that people have a strong identity with, maybe. Hopefully that may change now, but typically you're not getting a lot of workers who say, I fundamentally identify as an unemployed worker, I want to organize around this issue, although fortunately we are seeing that now thanks to some organizing efforts from groups like Center for Popular Democracy and others. I think that it's low-hanging fruit for the employers. I think it's short-sighted. I think employers would actually benefit from a more robust unemployment assistance system, but they're not doing much to control their health costs, which dwarf unemployment costs, but they can go to their state legislatures and gut that unemployment insurance system. And there was a concerted effort to do that after the last recession. It's also this program that's supposed to be self-financing and just is far from it. So there's a tax that funds it, and that varies at the state level, but at the federal level, it's uniform. And they see those dollars and go after it, and maybe the benefits aren't quite as explicit and tangible. It again gets back to that accounting bias, something that you quite easily see in your balance sheets. You go after, even though the big cost or the big benefit is elsewhere.
Sort of longer term. Yeah. One of the great things about the child tax credit is it's based on a policy that's been tried and tested in many other parts of the world. Many different countries. The UK implemented one, and as a part of a package of other reforms, many of which we have, and we saw child poverty really fall. Australia, Canada saw very large child poverty reductions. I know you did some work with the Canadian government on poverty. And you learn all these interesting things, like in a lot of other countries, actually they see it as a pro-fertility policy, a policy because the birth rate has been declining. In fact, the United States at like a 40-year low in the birth rate, and really we actually want to be having more kids, but the child tax credit seems, the child benefit seems to increase births for a short amount of time, but then things level out, and there's really no evidence of increasing the number of births over the long term. And so we can see these poverty reductions in other places. We can see labor market effects. There seems to be sort of no incentive or disincentive in the aggregate, although different groups sort of move up and down. One thing that we've was a lot of concern at the hearing among some of the representatives was the question of inflation. So Bronte Munson has this question, common opposition point by the Republican Party is proposals like the American Rescue Plan are a direct cause of inflation, and that's a big concern that we have. So what is your response on that? And if you agree, if you believe the numerous benefits of these outweigh inflation, what's the case there?
Right. So you see inflation when you have some increase in demand without a matching increase in productive capacity to meet that demand. And I think there's little reason to believe that's what's going to happen in the long run. I think there's inflation's already been slowing. To be clear, it's high, and that is of concern in the sense that all other things being equal, inflation eats away at people's living standards. Of course, it's not the case at all other things being equal. And in fact, these transfers will dwarf the inflation effects, certainly for the lower income households who receive them. And I think some of the supply chain problems that we've been facing are being worked through. Not all of them. We still have incredible backlogs of ships, for example, with full containers off the Long Beach, Los Angeles area shores. These things obviously take time in the midst of a pandemic to work through. We weren't prepared for it. We can certainly do better there. But I do want to just note that it's something we can monitor. There are tools and strategies for controlling it, including actually some of the proposals out there right now for consideration under the reconciliation bill. Of course, some of those proposals, say, for example, negotiating with the government's leverage for prescription drugs, that would reduce inflation, healthcare inflation, which has in the long run been one of our largest drivers of overall inflation, could be tackled. Now, of course, you're seeing a lot of opposition and pushback from industries that would be affected. Why is that? So, when there's inflation, this is one thing that I think wasn't quite right in my friend and colleague, Doug Holtz-Eakin's testimony, where he said money just vanished because of inflation. It didn't vanish. It went into someone's pockets in some ways, because that's what happens in some cases like this, right? So why are they opposing it? It'll reduce drug price inflation. Well, because there's profits there to be made too. So I think that, there's policy around competition, around taking on some of the sort of monopolistic power that some businesses have in certain industries that would help reduce inflation. There's infrastructure investments. There's investments in increasing labor supply, like caregiving investments. We're talking about, I think, estimates by the Economic Policy Institute of 4 million jobs from the infrastructure and Build Back Better sort of overall package, the reconciliation bill plus the infrastructure package. And that means that we can match the sort of supply with the demand. The last thing I'd say is I think we have for a long time been running rather low inflation, and there is probably some optimal level of inflation. And I'm not sure it's been the barely 2 and below 2% we've been running. One of the things to think about is how inflation also eats away at debt. So debt holders, all other things being equal, can be better off. So imagine you have a mortgage, you have to pay $2,000 a month for it. Well, over 30 years, you're paying $2,000 a month. It's fixed rate mortgage. By the end of it, it's not as costly in a sense, those $2,000 as at the beginning of it, right? And inflation is the reason why. And so, we have some debt challenges in this country, especially with student loans. And so debt holders may want to keep inflation at a different rate than those who are owing money to folks, and that's an important tension to keep in mind.
We have a question from YouTube from a friend we have in common, Julie Kirksick, who I imagine is tuning in from Milwaukee. She says, one of my struggles over time is how to help people think about shared values that underlie policies. What is the social contract that we make with each other? And I'm going to ask you to talk about that. And I'm also going to, Julie is one of the nation's leading proponents, and I would say experts on subsidized jobs programs, and programs that don't just provide a cash transfer, but provide work. And so I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about, think about her question. And then you also have written a widely read paper on subsidized programs, and I believe are a proponent of doing more of that in the future. So why would we do that, and what does that offer that cash transfers or other things don't get to?
Well, let me start there, which only relative to a question about the social contract is easier. But I think first, thank you to Julie, who is truly a giant in the anti-poverty space. And I hope folks familiarize themselves with her work if they haven't, including especially the New Hope program that she ran in the mid 90s in Milwaukee, which taught us a lot of lessons that we're still trying to apply to this day about ensuring that everyone who wants to work and is able to work has a job and the supports they need to meet a minimal standard of living, including through earning supplements. I think that people overwhelmingly want to work. Almost nobody spends year after year not working if they're in any way able to work. The challenge is often having enough jobs in the right place that match with people's skills, having the right job preparation, having the right quality, so that people can balance their other responsibilities in life, whether that's caregiving, even their own health needs, and more. So why wouldn't we want to ensure that there are jobs for everyone, and that those jobs meet some minimum standards? So I think that subsidized jobs, where typically the government helps offset the cost of employment for a short or modest duration, can help. Can help us transfer greater resources to folks than if they weren't working. Can help them gain work experience. And it seems to help with other measures that don't show up necessarily in the labor market, the way you labor market indicators like reducing criminal legal system interaction, improving mental health, and even increasing two-parent family formation. So I think that there are a lot of reasons for us to advance that. It also can be beneficial to businesses and employers, and there's some evidence that at least some programs can be cost beneficial in the long run, especially a great model being Julie's New Hope program, which Greg Duncan and others have evaluated, I think, quite rigorously, and evidence suggests that the costs would be potentially even drowned out by the benefits. The social contract, I'd love to hear what everyone else thinks. I fundamentally tend to see race as quite central to our policies, and I tend to think, based on political science and other research, that the problem is we don't see each other, and frankly, especially some people don't see some families and children of color as sort of worthy of support and the same lives that they themselves might have for their own kids. And I think if we want to build a social contract that works and is worthy of the American people, we do have to tackle the sort of racial views of so many folks in this country, the structural racism in so much of our policies. And that doesn't mean that's everything. I think a major reason why caregiving work is poorly paid is because women do it. It is also disproportionately women of color, but it's like 90% plus women who do at least formal caregiving work. So there's lots of people we undervalue in this country. And then at the end of the day, we should see our fates intertwined, because they are. And again, sometimes it doesn't always show up, but I promise you, we would have even better folks in the most important roles, as teachers, as doctors, as scientists, if everyone had a fair shot and it was the best people who got there. I think Chetty and other researchers have found evidence that we are losing lots of innovation to underinvestment in children, especially in marginalized communities. And I think if a contagious disease pandemic doesn't allow us to see how deeply intertwined our lives are with each other, I'm not sure what will.
Hey, I'm going to throw two questions at you at once. First is from Lucas Hagen. he asks, who have you found yourself working with during the pandemic that you did not expect to have as an ally in your work? And then Omar asks a I think a related question, which is, I think both you and I, as well as Doug, mentioned bipartisanship in some of what was done on the economic relief package. And so Amal's just wondering, what do we think about bipartisanship during this era of polarization, and how we think of that going forward? Should we be seeking bipartisanship? Should one party or the other be seeking action?
Yeah, important questions for the future of our country. I'd say I think a lot of us who maybe identify as working on social justice have found allies on especially some of the income transfer side with some libertarians that we may not work with so much, who saw the macro benefits. They certainly saw the hardships to some extent that people faced, and thought cash is something, again, that we can do and gives people freedom to meet their needs how they want. I always compliment with that, with a fundamental need for public goods and services and quality systems for childcare and healthcare. I'm not a supporter of, say, voucherizing healthcare or education, K through 12, which is where the logic could take you. I think there's also benefits to our society of having people in more integrated settings and learning together, and even in care together, which might be undermined by those approaches. But so in that sense, it was somewhat of a surprise, also not shocking. There has been some growth, I think, especially within this Cannon Center, in making some peace with redistribution and transfers, I would say. And more than that, but encouraging and supporting them, especially when they show up as cash. So 3 out of the 4 relief packages were bipartisan, by basically any definition. That was maybe a big deal. It may be because people in elected office nationally know that the president's party is typically held to account for economic performance, fairly or unfairly. And you see this similarly with the debt limit vote, whether people are willing to vote for it or not. Depends often on whether they're the same party of the occupant of the White House. So I'm not sure what the motivation always was, but it was to some extent unusual. The American Recovery Act was barely bipartisan, and a lot of legislation, certainly the American Rescue Plan, was not at all. But I think that sometimes we can come together immediately in a crisis, but so long as the response is temporary. I think the challenge is once we want structural responses. Yeah, and I'd love for the country to be more bipartisan, all other things being equal. I will say, harmful as it is, I think a lot of what's happened is there's been more unification and ideological clarity for each party. Doesn't mean they don't have their divides and divisions, but there's been more sorting, at least among elected officials. And I think the challenge in some ways is, how do you tackle that? Is it self-fulfilling? I tend to think that the extreme economic inequality feeds a lot of the political inequality. People live just completely different lives. Doesn't mean that people with high incomes don't vote for more equitable outcomes. It doesn't mean that people with low incomes don't vote for policies that might allow higher income people to keep more or have or earn or otherwise get wealthier. But in general, I think that people just live such different lives that they often can't appreciate or understand why it is that some people are struggling. And then those who do, they, of course, they're experiencing it. They're living that life themselves. And I have wondered if, a big boost to a widespread sort of and more widely sort of and diverse national and community service program might help us sort of connect with each other, learn about each other's lives. And, we do have some evidence that, for example, roommate assignments in college that are random have reduced racial animosity, racist views about people of color. And I think there's other evidence too, that when your neighbor, for example, is a person of color, especially if your neighbor, from the research I've seen, is Black, that you're less likely you actually change your views. It's not just about who is likely to live next to somebody who is Black in this case, but there's evidence that your views actually change to be more egalitarian over time. So I think less segregation in every aspect of our life could help with our political political sort of bifurcation.
Indy, we've got one more student question from Olivia Chang, and she asked about the child tax credit, but you could really ask the same question about the stimulus payments as well as expanded unemployment insurance. And she's taking a bit from, I think, my testimony, but I'm going to pose the question to you. So all of these programs really pay the same amount to families low and middle income. And, we've already talked about sort of going higher up the income. But maybe there's obviously there's a strong case for paying more benefits to those who are lower income because they might have more needs. So how do you think about like a benefit structure, and why shouldn't the child tax credit pay more money to those who are struggling, down the income ladder?
Yeah, that's a really important policy consideration. I think it's important to start with what the pre-pandemic status quo was, which is that actually people who had the least income were getting the smallest benefit. Yeah, sometimes nothing, right? We were ignoring their first few $1,000s in earnings and not giving them any benefits because of that. And then we phased in a benefit in a way that meant that many people with low and moderate incomes were not getting their maximum benefit. So with that being the prior state of affairs, this was a market improvement. There is, I think, a real case to be made, but it may vary by program and by need, but that you receive more social benefits when programs offer greater benefits to especially children, but in some other cases, seniors and other adults in very low income households. And we also want to make sure that if there is a job available, if you get a salary increase, a wage increase, that you're always better off. So we want to sort of just keep that in mind. That doesn't mean you can't give greater benefits where you're going to get the biggest sort of bang for your buck, which is very often, I think, in families with very low incomes. And also, just one thing to keep in mind, sort of depends on the benefits. You don't want someone who's getting, they're able to go to, say, Head Start, but then say their mother gets a raise and they get pulled out, then their mother loses a job, then they get back in. You also want some stability in the lives of children. And I think that argues to some extent for at least permitting, you can do sliding scales, but at least permitting a somewhat more expensive eligibility than otherwise. And housing assistance, often you have to contribute a percent of your income to it. You don't want people to completely lose some benefits. We see this struggle with the U.S. has some of the strictest disability benefit eligibility criteria in the world. And people who might say, "Oh, I can do a little bit of work. Maybe I can do something 10 hours a week," but you don't want to lose. You don't want to risk losing your benefits permanently because of that. So we also think about earnings disregards and other approaches, holding people harmless, to encourage people to do whatever they're capable of, and that the opportunities in the community they live in offer them, while also not making them worse off.
Thank you, Indy, for spending a lunch hour with us. We really appreciate your time. We'll have to have you to campus for real. And it was just a real pleasure to see you in person this week for the first time in a really long time.
So thank you, Luke. I really enjoyed it. These are terrific questions. I look forward to listening into other events in this series. And if anyone wants to donate books for my empty bookcase, we just moved offices, but I always welcome suggestions as I restock in my new office. But thank you all for just spending the time here asking terrific questions. And I hope people do consider careers in this space. I think we could benefit from all of your experiences, not just in school, but in life, in helping us address these challenges.
Yeah, so thank you to everyone who tuned in on YouTube Live, and keep those incredible questions coming. I want to see just too many video questions next week. That's my goal for you. We invite you back to spend lunch with us next Friday as well, with Professor Jeremy Levine talking about his new book about community and community decision making. So I hope you'll attend. For more information, check out poverty.umich.edu. Thank you, Indy, and thanks everyone. And we'll see you next week. Same bat time, same bat channel.